Our story starts when in 1681 a fire destroyed many of the town properties. At this time the town was centred within the Roman walls. This was in the area of the church, the grammar school, the vicarage and the beast market. After this the main town began to develop around what we now know as the marketplace, probably starting with Caistor House. There was already the Sessions House. In this talk, we're particularly considering the development of what is now known as Number 3 Marketplace. We will be following the people who owned, lived and worked in the building. I hope you will share your photographs and memories. The first owners, and I assume the family who had it constructed, were rope makers and flax dressers. The Caistor Heritage Trust has in its possession the original rope maker's machine. There were 4 rope makers' yards in Caistor. Flax is a flowering plant. A flax dresser was a worker who separated the coarse part of flax or hemp with a hackle. This was to produce linen. In 1792, there are 2 shops in the marketplace for sale. They were adjoining each other. Mr. Samuel Phillips was to show the premises to any interested clients. From the advertisement, it seems clear that Samuel is using the 2 shops. In addition, he had 2 shops for sale in or near the marketplace in Market Raisin. There was land at Caistor Ings, near the route of the proposed navigation canal, and at Smithfield in North Kelsey. The ropers and flax dressing business was also up for sale, and seems to be the one that was situated at the top of Cromwell View. It did include a newly erected tenement. I am guessing that the Samuel Phillips who was selling the property was married to Frances Smith, and they had 6 children. It is possible that Samuel's father was Samson, born in 1734. And there were 2 siblings, Edward and John. John is interesting as he married Sarah Meanwell in 1746. As will be discovered in future talks, the Meanwell family had a bakery business in the 19th century at number 29. Did the enclosures encourage the families to emigrate? There is some indication that they may have gone to the United States. Number 3 is part of the same structure as number 4, but its width is much less than numbers 2 or 4. The ground floor plan is open. The rear of the ground floor area is heavily altered, with access via the enclosed stairway. Very little is retained on the first and second floor. The second floor having been opened up, so 3 and 4 form a single open space. Accessed from an entrance adjacent to 9 High Street is a narrow passageway which leads to a small enclosed brick structure. It contains various phases of development. This building appears to have its origins in the early 19th century and seems to have a small lodging workshop. The internal inspection of this building has been limited. John Atomy was born at Nettleton in 1780. We have evidence that he was a tailor in 1818 and in 1823, and by 1835 a draper. He was in the freehold records between 1822 and 1831. Between 1828 and 1831, he is a member of the Caistor Association for the Prosecution of Felons.
Hull Advertiser and Exchange Gazette of the 6th December 1822. On the night of the 14th, Mr. Gibbons, landlord of the Greyhound Inn in Market Raisin, had his granary broken open and a quantity of men's wearing apparel stolen therefrom, which belonged to Mr. Utterby of Caistor and Mr. Lee of Tealby, tailors and drapers, which were lodged there for the convenience of attending on market days. The depredators were successful in escaping with the booty without being detected. Later it was reported that a most desperate gang of robbers, consisting of Thomas Wilson, Edward Broxholm and Edward Taylor, were apprehended at Louth by the constable and assistants after a most determined resistance. They were lodged in the House of Correction and then committed to Lincoln Castle for a number of offences throughout North East Lincolnshire. Jane Atkin was also committed for receiving part of the ready-made clothes, knowing them to be stolen. In the summer of 1825, John had a bay mare stolen from a field in Sandbraes belonging to John Watmouth. The mare was described as being about 15 hands high, with 4 black legs, a few white hairs on the face. The near side of the huck has had the hair rubbed off and a darker colour now grown in its place. Mane long and lies well, shows blood in her legs, hangs the bottom lip and is rising 6 years old. A reward of 10 guineas has been offered by John, plus another 10 guineas offered by the Association of the Prosecution of Felons for a conviction. If the mare has just strayed and is returned, expenses plus a reward will be paid by John.
By 1842 he is selling a house and shops with 2 stalled stables and hayloft adjoining. The premises, he says, has been a successful tailor's and draper's for the past 50 years. Was this number 3 and number 4? Did John Liggett, who ran a business at number 4 and married John Utterby's daughter, Ellen, in 1827, purchase the shops? In the 1841 census, John Utterby was said to be of independent means and living with his wife Ellen and his daughter, aged 13, who was also called Ellen. At the same time, and in 1852, the poll book describes John as a gent. 10 years later, he is living with his wife and granddaughter on Whitegate Hill as a house proprietor. In 1857, he died. The first evidence of a definite occupant of number 3 was in 1841. This was Francis Wilson, a 30-year-old tailor who was born in Hull. His wife, Jane, was about the same age, and they had 3 children, Mary born in London and John and Sarah in Caistor. There is an invoice held in the Lincolnshire Archives to J. G. Dixon for £12, 2 shillings and 6pence. The owner, as we have already heard, was John Utterby, though he lived elsewhere in the town. Francis Wilson left the business and by 1851, with his wife, was a teacher at the workhouse, and living there with him was his children. 10 years later, he is a farmer living in Moor Lane, Caistor, where the present-day Wilsons live. By 1871 his wife has died and he is back to being a tailor and living in Gresby. He then died in 1872, the following year. George Brocklesby was born in Caistor in 1820, the eldest son of Charles and Elizabeth Brocklesby, who were living in Back Street, which is now known as North Street. Charles Brocklesby, despite claiming to be a gardener, seemed to be comfortably well off. Charles also had family connections to the Atomy family, who had number 3 between 1818 and 1831. Also connections with the Liggett family, who had number 4 between 1844 and 1858. And finally, the Gooseman family, who were butchers in the Cornhill. Charles appears to have owned property in Back Street, as, on his death in 1858, he left rents from these properties to other members of the family. George first appears in the marketplace on the 1851 census, aged 30, with his wife Susanna. The couple never had any children. In his will, which was proved in 1858, Charles left George his son, number 3 marketplace, which George could work from and live in, providing he continued to pay the mortgage. By 1851, George Brocklesby was well established with a journeyman and 3 apprentices working in his shop. George regularly advertised for a sewing machinist or an undercutter. In 1859, Chas Dent of Kilby was summoned for trial on non-payment of debt for a suit, despite a judgment being made in 1855 for him to clear the debt. In February 1870, George decided he needed a new plate glass front on his shop, and after selling his old one, purchased a new one. In 1879, George and John Varlow from South Street attempted to form a trade protection society with 16 subscribers and a ratepayers association. In his heyday, he was a prominent leading citizen and a very active churchman. For a time, he was a church warden, and he was always concerned to encourage the musical side of his worship. In 1870, George canvassed for cash to be used for repairs of the town clock. On the 11th of March 1871, the 6th bell was hung in the tower. George Brocklesby had persevered to obtain this bell. It weighed 600 weight and was 33 inches in diameter. The bell was cast by tailors of Loughborough and unfortunately was cast out of tune. The vicar suggested it being called the Churchwarden's Folly or St. George because of it being out of tune. George was seen as fit and proper to serve as a constable and overseer between 1848 and 1851. He was also described in 1886 as a farmer of 60 acres on North Kelsey Road. The nursery farm employed 1 man and 1 boy.
Caistor. Accident. On Saturday night last, about 6:30, as Mrs. de Mowbray, wife of the Reverend Mr. de Mowbray, and Miss Hammond were driving home from Caistor to Nettleton Lodge, a somewhat serious accident happened which might have terminated fatally. As they were turning the first corner on Union Road, a dog belonging to Alfred Stevenson, foreman at Dr. Mackintosh's farm, bolted through the hedge and seized one of the horse's hind legs, making the animal spring up aside and turn over the vehicle, breaking off the shaft of one of the wheels and throwing the unfortunate occupants violently on the ground. Both ladies were seriously bruised and Miss Hammond's face was severely lacerated. The ladies were taken to the house of Mr. Brocklesby close by and shortly afterwards conveyed home. We are glad to hear both are progressing favourably. The dog, which was in the habit of seizing horses' heels as they passed on the road, has been destroyed.
He did not have this farm in 1871. During his long tenure, he saw the gradual erosion of Caistor and his own prosperity. By 1889, George was in trouble.
A little higher up on the same side was Mr. Brocklesby, the tailor. He was a great character, a most regular churchman, where he sang in a deep bass voice. He was not in the choir. He always carried 2 tuning forks, and he would amuse us by sounding them on his counter or anywhere else convenient. While he did so, he could say, buzzing in time, "This is a C fork," and sounding another the second time, again buzzing in tune, "And this is a hay fork," having more command over his tuning forks than over his H's. Once, in the Red Lion private bar, where Brocklesby was privileged to meet the so-called better class of customers at that hostelry, my uncle, Sam Haddersley, had some fun with Brocklesby, who prided himself on always using correct phrases. My uncle asked him this: "Is it proper to say, 'Gentlemen, what will you have?' or 'Gentlemen, what will you take?'" Upon which Brocklesby said, "Gentlemen, what will you take?" So my uncle said, "Thank you, I will have a brandy and soda." They all ordered drinks, for which poor Brocklesby had to pay.
By 1889, George was in trouble. Solicitor Charles Brown was writing to solicitors and mortgage holders, trying to stave off further action to recover monies owed to them. To a London solicitor he wrote, "George Brocklesby has been poorly for some time, and likely to continue so." In another he says George Brocklesby has got softening of the brain, and his wife is nearly as bad. It is doubtful he will ever be able to do business again. What was to happen next was undecided, but he asked people to wait. At times, George was rather dangerous and was getting worse. On the 6th of May 1889, Charles Brown wrote that George Brocklesby was now at Bracebridge Asylum in Lincoln. George died on the 23rd of May 1889. By December 1889, things appeared very bleak for Mrs. Brocklesby, and it was feared she would be penniless. Miss Maris was very angry at the bank over its claims to money from George Brocklesby's estate and threatened to take her business elsewhere. She was a millionaire in today's money. The bank backed down. In 1890, a year after George had died, Chas Brown's solicitor had a complaint made over his charges on dealing with the Brocklesby estate, to which he stated, "The shop is still closed and not likely to let. Put up for sale now, it wouldn't make £300. In 1849 it was said that Susanna Brocklesby is not competent mentally and entirely dependent on charity. The vicar has written to the solicitor asking if she may have some of the money held to cover debts to be used for Susanna's benefit. The largest creditors consented, considering the position Mrs. Brocklesby had in the town, stating it would be a shame if she was put in the workhouse. She was looked after by Mr. and Mrs. Wright for about 2 years. Mrs. Brocklesby had her food and 5 shillings a week from Mr. Wright's brother. She gave Mr. Wright a watch and chain when she went into the infirmary of the workhouse. Susanna Brocklesby died in 1895. John Kennington, an ironmonger from the High Street, bought number 3 Marketplace for £390 in May 1890. He found it difficult to let, and it was still empty in April 1891. We talked about Archibald Radford in the film about number 2, the Marketplace. Archie had number 3 as a draper and grocer, but at the same time managed the central stores at number 2 for Mr. Lord. Archie had come from Lawsington and returned there as a shopkeeper after serving in the First World War. Between 1913 and 1928, a Miss Caroline Parsons, a milliner, was the tenant. John Kennington was probably still the owner at this time. There was a connection between the Kennington family and Caroline Parsons. How it came about, I am not sure. Caroline was a visitor to John Kennington's family in 1891 and 1901, where she's marked as a worker and milliner. In 1911, she was boarding with Annie Kennington, John's daughter, in the High Street and working on her own account. Caroline was born in Grimsby in 1857. She had 2 brothers and a sister, and her mother, who by 1861 was a widow, working as a milliner. They lived at that time in Victoria Street. I can find no record of Caroline's father's death or marriage. As her mother was born in Harwich, was the connection to do with shipping? Caroline's mother, also a Caroline, in 1868 remarried at Hull to a John Thomas Cooper. John was a railway shunter and by 1881 was a tobacconist in Freeman Street. A number of items were donated by Janice Dean and the Kennington family to the Caistor Heritage Trust. A 1920s dress insert, probably made by Miss Parsons. At 1 9p each, 3 plain embroidered collars. A long golden lawn shawl. Caroline died at Caistor in 1932. When her will was published, it was stated to be worth £2,214, 8 shillings and 4p. That's equivalent to about £150,000 today. Arthur Francis Harness was born in 1878 at Wainfleet, Lincolnshire. His father George was a letter carrier at the time of Arthur's birth. When the family moved to Matlock, Bath before 1891, George was still a postman. By 1901, Arthur was not living with the family at Matlock, but with his uncle, John Moody, a coal merchant in Islington. Arthur at this time was a railway goods clerk. 10 years later, when he was 32, he was said to be a clerk, storekeeper and baker. In 1916, he marries Jane Bates at Spilsby. There is no record of them having any children. During World War I, he has been called up and his obituary says he saw service in Russia. I wonder if this was part of a series of multinational military expeditions which began in 1918, helping with the securing of supplies of munitions and armaments in Russian ports and of re-establishing the Eastern Front. This needs more research, as it is recorded on the electoral rolls. He was by 1918 living at number 8 Thornhill Square, Islington. Arthur and his wife were still living in Thornhill Square until 1922. In 1924 and 1925, they were living in Pat's Hole Road, St Pancras, with 3 other people. No records have been found between 1925 and 1933. Between 1933 and 1937, he is known to be running a draper shop at number 3 Marketplace. We can assume he had, as with previous occupiers of 2 to 4 Marketplace, close contacts with the Methodist Church. By 1939, he and his wife had retired to St Hubert's Drive in Skegness. Arthur comes out of retirement to work as a clerk at Pulteney's Garage in Skegness. He was involved in various Methodist churches in Skegness and died in 1956. In his will he left £3,450, 9 shillings and 5p, of which he left £100, a lawn mower and extended ladder to the executor, Maurice Peat. James Albert Carr was born in the year 1878 at Rotherham. His parents were John and Mary. In 1904, at the age of 26 years, he married Alice Ethel Littlewood. There were 5 children. By 1911, he was a grocer's manager at Pontefract. In 1914, he is said to be a commercial traveller living in Nottingham. In December 1915, at the age of 37, James joins up in the Army Reserve. He was part of the 85th Training Reserve under the 20th Reserve Brigade, working with men from the Northumberland Fusiliers. In 1916, when conscription was first introduced for the British Army, the existing regimental system could not cope with a large influx of recruits. By January 1916, to train the recruits from 1916 onwards, 26 reserve brigades were raised. The Northumberland Fusiliers earned 67 battle honours in the First World War and won 5 Victoria Crosses, but at the cost of over 16,000 dead. James seems to have been demobbed in June 1918. It is not clear where he was living after the war or what his trade was, but between 1934 and 1938 he was living in Doncaster with his family. By 1939 he's living in North Kelsey Road with his wife and possibly 2 of his children. He was in number 3, the marketplace, as a draper until about 1948. By then he would have been about 70 years old. Again, like many others running these shops, they were Methodists. But did they stay in Caistor? What happened to them?
Joseph Lane was described as a master draper and salesman living in Bawtry in 1939. His father, Joseph Henry, who was also a draper, was killed at the Battle of the Somme in 1918. Joseph moved to Caistor from Bawtry sometime after 1939. His daughter Susan tells us, "My mum and dad moved from Bawtry to Caistor. My father, Joseph Lane, had the shop next to Talbot's. I seem to remember that the Talbots had cats and we would hear them from Mum's bedroom. I have to admit I never went inside the Talbots' shop. I guess they sold a lot of the same things Mum did. My father's name, Joseph Lane, was above the shop until he died in the 1950s. When he had the shop, we sold women's clothes as well as children's clothes, wool, ties, caps, etc. We had a room upstairs where the women's things were kept. My dad also travelled around the district selling things from the shop. Mum changed the name of the shop after he died and stopped selling women's clothes. Mum sold baby and children's clothes, caps, ties, handkerchiefs and wool, plus other bits and pieces. My mum was in the shop every day except Sundays. It was okay living behind and above the shop, and the house had 3 stories. Our kitchen and dining room were behind the shop. We didn't have a range, but there was an oven beside the fire, which Mum used every Sunday. During the week, we used the electric cooker in what we called the scullery. The main disadvantage to the building was that our record player was in the sitting room, which was above the shop. I have memories of Mum telling me to turn it down as she could hear it in the shop. I had to stand at the back of the shop and wait if I wanted her, and woe betide me if I forgot to hold the door open for customers. Also, there was Dorothy Capp from Graspy, who used to look after myself and my brother Ron. I was born there in 1948 and lived there until I got married in 1966. I remember going on my bicycle all the way to Cleethorpes and Wonderland, myself and my friend Pat Goulton. We made it there, but we were glad that her dad gave us a lift back. I never did that again. Mum sold the shop to Cordell's when I got married. Other people have memories of the shop and my parents, and they have said, "I do remember both your dad and Mum. Your dad was a Methodist Sunday school teacher, and I thought he was the nicest, kindest man in Caistor. He was a really lovely person. You had the best birthday parties ever. We played hide and seek, and there were some big wardrobes up in the attic and loads of cupboards and nooks and crannies to hide in. I also remember doing a mannequin parade of children's clothes. I think this was at the Methodist chapel."